Hey everyone, this is Mr. Silbaugh here, and this is my lesson on writing learning objectives for my Intro to Education class. So, whenever you're a teacher, you're going to want to set goals for your students to learn something. And we do that through the process of objectives. So you have different points of time you want them to master them in too. So you want to make sure that you are setting them up for success and that they can achieve them in a reasonable amount of time. As always, your objectives should be clear, measurable, and they should be easy to understand. Those of you who may remember in classrooms that when you look at the teacher's board, you'll see that they have the objective written, and it's written for you to understand. That's their goal for you for that lesson and what they want you to achieve. So the first thing we'll talk about, and I'm going to chunk this out into how you would set up to write an objective. The first thing is you want to say the time period. So when I say the time period, it's when you want them to accomplish that objective. So you need a specific and set deadline of when the objective should be accomplished. In the teaching world, we usually use the following: the end of the lesson, the end of the day, the end of the quarter, the end of the year, end of the unit. Like there's multiple ways that you can do this, and you would set objectives for each period, okay? And if you give them a project, for example, you're not going to expect them to master it by the end of the day. A project is ongoing. So if you're giving them and assigning them a project, you're going to want them to finish it and complete it, learn that objective by the end of the project, not necessarily just the end of the lesson. So who? This is the next step. Who do you want to master this objective? You could say individual students, but that's more for setting up individual objectives and individual goals. That's very time consuming, and we have the same objective for everyone. But usually we have the whole class, okay? And when you do this, you would write it as the student will be able to, or the learner will be able to, whatever you feel more comfortable with. There's multiple ways to write the who part of this. One that we usually always use in the educational world is the TSWBAT, or the student will be able to, or you can drop off the T at the front for SWBAT. You can also replace that student with learner, however you want to do this, okay? Usually I myself write it out, but you may be more comfortable writing it like that. So the next part, and we're going to get to it, is writing the verb part of it, what the action part of it's going to be. But we're going to start off with Bloom's taxonomy because when we write objectives, we usually write them to Bloom's taxonomy. We talked a little bit about him during our theorist unit. If you remember, we have the levels of complexity. However, it starts off very basic and goes more advanced. So remember is at the bottom, and these are just remembering and recalling simple things. Understanding is them actually understanding and making connections, being able to explain it. Applying is they're using the information that they've learned in new situations and new places. They've taken what they've learned in the past, either by remembering and understanding it, and applying it to new situations. Analyzing is they're taking what they've learned in previous situations and applying or analyzing it and coming up with new conclusions and drawing connections. Everything's being pulled together. After that is evaluating. After that, they can make a decision, justify, they're defending an argument, things like that. And then the last, the very peak, is create. Creating is whenever you've taken everything that you have done and put it into a new form. You're taking what you've learned and you're producing something new and creative. So we talk about picking the verb. When you pick the verb, you want to make sure you pick the correct verb. And when I say verb, I'm talking about the action. What are they specifically doing? What do you want your students to do? You'll need to pick the best verb that fits what the students are doing. Not all verbs work for all situations, so you have to be very careful. And that's why I say on the next slide, Pay attention, and you'll see this again. The higher on the taxonomy, the more advanced the activity, and the better it's going to be. You create better, authentic learning experiences, meaning you create better learning whenever it's higher on the Bloom's level. So these are the Bloom's verbs. There's a lot of them. You don't need to memorize these. But some of these allow you to create new experiences based upon the verbs. So at the very bottom, we have remembering, like highlighting or memorizing. We want to try and avoid these ones, okay? Next one, we have understanding. This is where we're starting to get at and starting to get better. Then we move into applying, and analyzing, evaluating, and creating. Really, we want to start and try and maintain here at the applying level, but not everything is going to fit into the same level, nor is every activity going to be able to be put into those different levels. So you have to really be creative and think about how you would phrase this and how you would use your specific verb. Caution. Please be careful. Do not ever, ever, ever use the word understand as your verb, okay? But why? That's because you can't measure and understand. If I tell you I want you to understand this, how am I going to measure that you actually understand it, okay? You could retell me what you learned, but it's not really a good objective because of the fact that there's no way to measure it and it's just understanding it. Okay, they're just going to be able to recall it. If they understand it, you're not expecting them to show that they know it. Whereas if you have a very basic like recall or memorize, they actually have that and you can see that they've learned that. And then lastly is the activity. What are the students going to be doing? What is the end goal? Usually in this case with the activity, you want to tie it to the standard that you picked for the objective. So the way that we do this is you put it together by using the general format: the timeline, the learner, the verb, and the activity. The timeline can also go at the end, but usually we do it like this. By the end of the unit, the student will be able to predict the end of a short story. So notice that I have my timeline, I have my learner who's going to be learning, what their verb, and what they're going to be doing. Okay? So the timeline is at the end of the unit, the learner, the student will be able to, the verb, predict, and then the activity at the end of a short story. The activity, I mean, it doesn't make real sense right here, but the end of a short story, the activity is they're going to be reading like short stories and predicting what's going to happen at the end of it. There's a little bit of flexibility with the word activity here, so just keep that in mind. It doesn't necessarily have to be an activity per se. So please note that not every activity fits into Bloom's. It's okay to have lower level objectives. If you decide to go into teaching, you'll learn to create higher level learning objectives, and that's ultimately the end goal here. And it's okay to have activities at the lower level, but you're going to want to start doing activities at the higher level. Usually your lower level learning objectives are ones in a specific lesson. And when you get to the end of your unit, you start using those more higher level learning objectives. So keep that in mind when you plan your own units. All right, that's going to do it for this lesson.